Today we'll talk briefly about Proverbs 1 and 2. Proverbs are pithy, short wisdom statements that encapsulate a truth that has general application. And the book of Proverbs is a collection of all these wise statements that were gathered over time by ancient Israelites. And what we have in this collection are words that still ring true today. Now, I want to point out that the theme or the thesis statement for the book of Proverbs is found in chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. So if you look at just those 7 verses, the author of Proverbs is laying out for us the entire thesis or purpose of the book of Proverbs. So let's read a bit of this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now we think about fear like, I'm afraid, I'm scared. In the ancient world, fear was more about awe and glory and respect, because the Lord is just so incredibly awesome. In the ancient world, people thought about encounters with God as something that's like overwhelming. And they sometimes use the word like deep awe and respect. And the English translators use the word fear, even though awe and respect and maybe overwhelming power might have been a better translation. So the book of Proverbs is to teach us how to be on God's path. Wisdom is following God's law. Wisdom is following God's covenantal instructions. This is the purpose of wisdom literature. I want to point out some significant connections to the Book of Mormon. There's this really compelling insight about Nephi that many of us miss because it's so obvious we don't think about it. Nephi knew how to write. In the ancient world, literacy was not very common. Most people didn't know how to read or write. Most people were farmers. They didn't need to know how to read or write because their job was planting and harvesting. And typically the only people who knew how to read and write were government officials, some prophets, and every now and then you might have merchants who might have some literacy. But as you know, learning how to read and write, and particularly to do it well, takes many, many years of practice and effort, and quite an investment of time and money. We know that Nephi comes from a family of wealth, that Lehi had the money. So Nephi likely went to a scribal school. Now, why does this connect to Proverbs? It turns out in the ancient world, when scribes were trained in the technical skill of writing, they were also trained in the cultural memory or wisdom of their society. And they would do this by, the scribal schools would have the scribes, the student scribes, practice writing out proverbial wisdom on tablets or papyrus. And by learning how to practice writing, they also had these wise sayings burned into their memory. So one way to understand more about Nephi's perspective and upbringing and worldview is to read the book of Proverbs and to see the key themes and doctrines. And if you go back to 1 Nephi, you will see wisdom themes playing throughout. I'll explain a few of those in just a minute. Well, I'll just tell a personal story. When I went to Yale University for one of my graduate degrees, I spent some time studying Assyriology. It's the study of the ancient Mesopotamia. And I studied with some of the great Assyrian scholars. And we were in the main library for Assyrian studies. And surrounding our classroom were hundreds of tablets that were in these glass cases. And as we would talk about ancient Mesopotamia, the professor would pull tablets off and talk about what they meant and how they were relevant to studying the ancient Middle East. And I remember one day he pulled a tablet off the shelf, and on one side was this beautiful cuneiform writing, and it actually had some proverbial wisdom, kind of like what we find here in Proverbs. And if you turned the clay tablet over, it was very messy writing. And what the professor pointed out is that this was a school tablet, that the teacher, in very fine writing, had written out the proverb, and the student had to copy it on the back. And you could see that the student was not yet a very well-trained scribe because they wrote very sloppily. And this tablet came from about 1800 BC in Babylon, about the time of Abraham. And I thought, it's very interesting. Nephi himself may have gone through a very similar process. And how do we see this playing out in the time of Nephi? Look at how Nephi expresses himself as a wise person, a wise man who hears the word of God, listens to his father respectfully, preserves those words, and teaches them to others. What do fools do? They rage against God. They don't listen to the word of God. They don't trust God. And notice about how Nephi constructs his narrative, that he's a wise man in the guise of God, and you have two older foolish brothers. And if you look at Proverbs, the fools are always set against the wise. And we want to be wise so we can find ourselves in God's good graces. I also point out that Laban, who wanted to not give away the word of God to help Nephi's family, was also a fool. He made rash statements and he acted in anger and he wanted to kill people. Only fools do those kinds of things. And from a literary standpoint, it's quite fascinating that if you take Laban's name and turn it backwards in Hebrew, the Hebrew word Nabal literally means fool. So it seems that Nephi is constructing his narrative to convince people that God is all good and wise, and we too should be wise, by providing characters in his narrative from his own life that played the fool, including Laban, whose own name backwards means fool. So let's take a look at just a few more verses here that might be personally valuable to us. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 2. My son or my child, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, or keep them or guard them or observe them, so that thou incline thy ear unto wisdom and apply thy heart to understanding, yea, if thou criest after knowledge and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest wisdom or her as silver and searchest for her as for hid treasure, then shalt thou understand the fear or awesomeness of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. All of us can do this. All of us can seek to understand the Word of God, to treasure those words in our heart, and thereby experience the awe of God's presence in our lives. I love the book of Proverbs. It was beautiful anciently. It's beautiful today. It meant a lot to the people in the past, and it still means a lot to us today and still has resonating power after all these hundreds of years.